Okay, welcome everyone to California Wildfire Strategies for Planning and Mitigation. My name is Tim Snellings. I'm going to walk through some definitions that are going to help our class today to be ready for our conversation with our panel that's coming up in a few minutes. So let me jump into some terms that I want to make sure we're familiar with, that we have a basic understanding of when we get to, when you hear them mentioned basically from our presenters, our panel members. So I'm going to walk through each of these. Defensible space, you're going to hear our fire captain talk about this quite a bit. And just want to give you a little visual for what defensible space is. And you'll see that I'm going to use this annotate tool. Okay, so you'll see the defensible space around, primarily what we're talking about is around residential structure and these different zones. And our fire expert's going to talk about that today. So it's essentially the separation around homes. I'm curious to ask him about, in more semi-urban or rural areas, how this exactly works with neighbors. Where you don't have 100 foot between homes and adjacent properties, so you don't control the ability to thin your neighbors' trees. People typically don't appreciate that. So that'd be an interesting topic of conversation. Embers, you're going to hear this talked about, especially in connection with some of these mega fires that we've had around California. Essentially there are these flame-throwing ignition sources that travel for miles and to become a real issue. And hopefully you've seen that in some of the videos, a real issue that needs to be, addressed quickly. Ember fires can become big fires that can merge into other fires. And you'll see that in our conversation as well. Fire adapted community. I'm going to show you a really great exhibit of this, but it's essentially where the community embraces the fact that they live amidst a fire-prone area. Wildfire is a natural part of our environment, and people need to be aware that that they're coexisting with fire, and they need to take the appropriate precautions. And it's not just one or two things, but it's a host of tools in the tool belt. And we'll talk about that as well. You may hear someone mention FireWise. There's a variety of programs. This one's administered by NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, and it's a voluntary program. It's a variety of these, along with Fire Safe Councils, are community engagement types of programs that get people involved with taking ownership and responsibility for the fire danger that exists in their community and their neighborhood, and it engages them to take specific steps and actions, whether it's chipper programs, doing annual maintenance on properties. There may be some larger scale tree removal projects that are coordinated through this, tree thinning projects, limbing projects where trees are limbed up higher to prevent some of the interconnectivity of fire being transmitted. So FireWise. Greenfield is another term you might hear. This is a land use term, and this is really having to do with buffers and hard edges. This is part of a strategy. This is the community, the city of Chico in Butte County. This is the city limits right here. And you can see on this west side of Chico, we have basically a green field area. This is ag land out here, and this is protected lands from urban development, from sprawling out this way. This is in the valley. So this is an example of, essentially, it becomes a boundary where, if fire started in this area, there would be, it would be very difficult for this area to burn, frankly. And so we'll talk about how that works in connection with planning more when we get into the WUI. This is not in the wildland urban interface, which we'll talk about in just a moment too. Ladder fuels, we have these different types of fuels. You know, we have fuels on the ground. We have them in this intermediate area that allow fire to travel up into the tree crowns. So this is some behavior that becomes very important. Our fire captain will talk about that, about the importance of picking this up as far as how to manage fire. Mitigation, this is a term that we use to talk about modifying the environment or behavior to reduce potential adverse impacts from a hazard. So there's a whole video. I talk about the variety of mitigation strategies to address fire risks, or can't eliminate the risk, but we can reduce them. You know, we have our general plans, our land use documents, which talk about where growth will occur in the future in our jurisdictions. We have these other plans. We'll talk about local hazard mitigation plans and community wildfire protection plans, and the roles of fire safe council. So these are ways that we mitigate the potential for wildfire to impact our communities. And certainly evacuation routes, plans, notification, communication systems, all very critical to the conversation. So this is not a one and done type thing. There are a lot of different ways that we pursue mitigation for managing the wildfire risk in a community. Preparedness, again, this is related to mitigation. Activities that lead to safe, efficient fire management programs. You know, I mentioned evacuation. You know, some jurisdictions have these evacuation zones actually in their community. And so you can see this is actually Paradise. And before the campfire, Paradise had learned from a fire that happened in 2008 that came all the way to the east side from the forested areas. It blew to the west, and it was stopped really along this blue line. This is the Feather River. And but the problem that happened back in 2008 was basically as the fire was approaching Paradise, the whole town of about 30,000 people evacuated all at once, and the 4 evacuation routes clogged, and they were essentially trapped. And a lot of lessons were learned through that experience in 2008. And so the community, through fire safe council activities, working with the fire departments, developed these evacuation zone strategies. You can see each of these zones. And the idea if a fire came up the canyon again was that there would be time to evacuate by zone so that the roads would be able to handle the evacuations. The problem with the campfire is, if you've watched any of the videos, was it moved essentially in about, essentially a couple hours from the start of the fire, which was about 4 miles away, into the town of Paradise. And there was not time for this phased evacuation plan to really work. But it is a good strategy, and you'll see it still used in some jurisdictions. So having evacuation zones. Prevention, that kind of goes without saying, but activities directed at reducing the incidence of fire, including education, fuel reduction projects. I like this slide too, this talking about resiliency, the ability to prepare for and plan for and absorb, respond, recover from, and more successfully adapt to fire. So when I think of preparation for wildland fire, we do our planning and mitigation, we do all of our planning documents, we prepare, we train, we have our emergency operation plans in place. An event happens, we have the incident response itself. So we have the incident response center on site, near the emergency. We have our emergency operations center operating, and as the fire in this case is put out, there's this long period of recovery that happens. And recovery, can be weeks, months, and in the case of things like the campfire, years. And then through this process, you track the lessons learned, and they feed into the next level of preparation, mitigation, modification of plans to create a more resilient community. So this is a really good slide, I appreciate. So I talked about this, surface fuels. This is just the fire that burns loose debris on the ground. You know, if you don't have ladder fuels, and we'll have our fire captain talk about this, it's possible to have surface fuel fires, you know, controlled burns that don't get into the crowns of the trees. So you can explain that more. And then, so that looks like a duplicate slide. So an urban conflagration are just these large mega fires. And so we'll talk about that. Excuse me, that a little bit. Wildland is just the undisturbed, not developed areas. You know, essentially development is non-existent except for roads, maybe cell towers, dirt roads, power lines, railroad. Wildfire hazard is the combination of all of these factors. You know, and then you add the density of trees, dryness of trees and shrubs. Wildfire risk takes the hazard and then adds things like temperature, humidity, drought, winds. And then you end up with obviously a wildland fire.
I landed it.
I'm sorry? Say again? Oh, maybe that wasn't for me. Okay.
I think it was just a mute issue.
Okay. And then lastly is the wildland urban interface. And this is what we're going to talk about quite a bit. You know, we have any developed area where conditions affecting the combustibility of natural and cultivated vegetation, fuels, and structures or infrastructure allow for the ignition and spread of fire through these combined fuels. So we have this interface that happens, you know, so in this area we have a lot of fuels essentially adjacent to urban development. Here's a real hard edges you can see in this picture number 2, where the development is right adjacent and surrounded by these heavy fuel loads. So this would be what we would call the wildland urban interface. And then we have on this third slide over here, we have the fuels, or the houses in this case, are intermixed with other fuels, the trees. And so we have this intermix pattern of design, which is obviously extremely dangerous. This is more like the Town of Paradise scenario, where you know, when I first started in Butte County in 2005, we were starting a new general plan update process, and I had the chance to go up in a small plane and fly over the county and get an aerial view. And when I flew over Paradise, the pilot told me, he said, there's about 30,000 people living down there. And I said, where? I don't see them, because they were so covered by the trees. And that's the classic example of intermix. So this is one of the PDFs in the files that you have in your resources. And I like this tool, this PDF, because it kind of highlights the point that there isn't just one solution. You know, we have the forested area here. So we have forest management projects to reduce the fuel loads. We have landscaping requirements to manage around homes. We have watershed management, which is an important part of fire. And we can have one of our experts talk about that. Building codes play a role. Land preservation tools, like I showed, the greenfield areas adjacent. So you have farmlands and golf courses and things like that, which provide essentially fire breaks to some degree. You have the role of local governments. You have subdivision standards and subdivision ordinances. You have land use and development codes. So that's where we have our general plans and open space codes and climate action plans, steep slope ordinances. So I like how you get a picture through this of all of these things working together to create this fire safe community. So that's kind of the point, and this may be something we're able to talk about as well. So that is going to wrap it up for this part of the discussion. And I'm going to stop the recording.